I didn't expect the night to go like this. I thought it would be the usual trip. A few days alone with my dog, Sam, in the woods. No cell service, no distractions. Just a quiet retreat to clear my head. But something about this cabin felt different. It was old, tucked away in the dense forest of Idaho, far from any roads, and the more I stared at it, the more it gave off a strange vibe. I thought I was just imagining things. I hadn't been here for more than an hour when I started second-guessing myself. It was late afternoon when we arrived, the sun casting long shadows through the trees as we unloaded the truck. Sam, my golden retriever, hopped out eagerly, his tail wagging as he explored the surroundings. I'd rented the place online, promised that it would be peaceful, a perfect getaway from the noise of city life. But now that I was here, I wasn't so sure. The cabin, though rustic and charming, seemed almost too isolated. The wood was weathered, the porch creaked underfoot, and the smell of pine and earth was thick in the air. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I opened the door. The interior was small but cozy. A fireplace, old leather chairs, and a few pictures on the walls that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The air was musty but smelled like the kind of place that could grow on you. Sam sniffed around, immediately finding his favorite spot by the window. I set my bag down and decided to explore the area. Maybe a walk around the cabin would help me relax. I grabbed a flashlight, knowing it would get dark quickly in the woods, and headed out with Sam by my side. We wandered for a while, the dense forest surrounding us. The trees were tall, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. The ground was uneven, covered with pine needles and fallen leaves. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound. Sam seemed a little on edge, occasionally pausing to look around or sniff at the ground as if sensing something I couldn't. We made our way down a small hill where I could see a creek running through the trees. I stopped there, taking in the view. It was beautiful, but it was also one of those moments where the isolation hit me all at once. No cars, no people, just nature. And yet, the deeper I looked into the forest, the more I felt like something was watching us. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the quiet, the vastness of it all. But it didn't help. Sam's ears perked up suddenly, and he started to growl low in his throat. I froze, looking around, but saw nothing. The forest was still just like before. "Easy, buddy," I muttered, but Sam was already backing up toward me, his tail tucked between his legs. It wasn't like him to act this way, especially not in the woods where we'd hiked before. Something was off, and it made my stomach tighten. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. As we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, the feeling of being followed lingering in my gut. When we got back to the cabin, I immediately locked the door behind us. Sam was still uneasy, pacing around the room. I set up the fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth would make everything feel normal again. The crackling flames were comforting, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Nightfall came quickly, and the wind outside picked up. It howled through the trees, rattling the windows. I sat in one of the old chairs near the fire, trying to relax. Sam curled up beside me, still on edge. The shadows from the fire flickered on the walls, and the longer I sat there, the more I began to imagine shapes in the corners of the room. But nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I was jolted awake by a loud noise, something tapping on the window. Sam was up, growling again, his hackles raised. I stood up quickly, heart racing. The tapping came again, louder this time, and it sounded as if it was coming from the side of the cabin, just beyond the reach of the light. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the window. My breath caught in my throat when I saw nothing outside. No movement, no animals, just the darkness of the woods. I stood there for a long time, the light trembling in my hand, until I felt foolish for even checking. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe an animal brushed against the window. But Sam wasn't having it. He continued to growl, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room, his body stiff. I tried to calm him, but I couldn't deny it. I was scared. There was something off about this place, and I couldn't put my finger on it. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the cabin was just old, creaky. Maybe there was a wild animal nearby. I didn't know, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I spent the next few hours checking every lock, securing the windows, and making sure Sam was calm. But by the time I decided to lie back down, the sense of unease had only grown stronger. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and I was up several times, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a branch outside. Each time, Sam would stir, his growls a constant reminder that something wasn't right. The morning came, and the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cabin. I thought about leaving, but something kept me there. Maybe it was the isolation I craved, or maybe it was the fear of what might happen if I left. Sam and I spent the morning in silence, walking the woods, but the feeling never fully lifted. That nagging suspicion, the sense that we weren't alone. By the time the sun began to set again, I was exhausted. I didn't want to spend another night in that cabin, but I also didn't want to face the forest at night alone, not with that eerie feeling weighing on me. So I stayed. That night, the tapping at the window started again. It was persistent this time, rhythmic almost. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing it. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and made my way outside, Sam right behind me. We circled the cabin, shining the light on every surface, but I found nothing. No footprints, no signs of an animal. I was about to give up when I heard a noise, a rustle from the trees at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. Then I saw him, a man standing just beyond the trees, tall, hunched, with a large coat that blended into the shadows. My blood ran cold. The man didn't move, just stood there, watching. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on him. Sam was barking fiercely now, but I couldn't bring myself to call out. I was paralyzed, my mind racing through all the worst possibilities. The man didn't come any closer. He didn't move at all, just stood there as if waiting for me to make the first move. I kept my distance, retreating back to the cabin, the light from the porch casting long shadows around us. Sam didn't stop barking until I slammed the door shut behind us. That was when I realized the truth. I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching us the whole time, from the very beginning. But why hadn't they done anything? What were they waiting for? I decided to leave. There was no more second guessing, no more waiting. I wasn't going to stay one more night in that cabin, not with a stranger watching from the woods. I packed quickly, and as soon as the truck was loaded, I drove out of there, not looking back. Sam sat beside me, still tense, still on alert. I don't know what that man wanted or why he was there. I never saw him again. All I know is I got out, and I don't think I'll ever return to that cabin. The road ahead seemed brighter somehow, the trees less menacing. I just knew I was glad to be away from that place. Back in the fall of 2016, I was 33 and working a job in a small automotive shop in eastern Kentucky. The town was nothing special. One of those quiet places where the gas station still had those old soda machines out front and everyone knew your last name. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship and was looking for anything to break the routine, something that would get my mind off things for a while. I had a habit of scrolling through local classifieds in the evenings just to see what people were posting. Everything from old lawnmowers to fishing boats to weird antiques. That's when I found a listing that caught my eye. It wasn't listed under rentals or vacation homes. It was tucked away in the miscellaneous section, posted by someone named G.R. Langston. Secluded cabin available for weekend use. No frills. Off-grid. $40 per night. Must bring your own food and bedding. Near Langston Cemetery. No Wi-Fi. No power. Firewood provided. Use at your own risk. I read it over a few times. I didn't know anyone named Langston, but the cemetery name didn't surprise me. A lot of things in that region were named after families that had been there for over a century. I Googled it and found the cemetery easily. Small, fenced in, about 20 miles out of town along an old county road near the base of a ridge. Couldn't find much else. No reviews, no photos, just the listing and a phone number. I didn't call. I texted. The person responded with a long message. Cash only. Leave it in the red tin inside the door. If you break anything, fix it. If you take anything, leave something of equal value. Gates unlocked. Cabins just past the cemetery. Stay on the gravel path. I don't know what got into me. Maybe I was just sick of being around people. Maybe I liked the idea of doing something different. I had 3 days off coming up and figured, what the hell? I left early Friday morning. Threw a bunch of basic stuff in the back of my truck. Sleeping bag, a few cans of soup, my camp stove, water jugs, headlamp, extra batteries, a book, my .38 revolver, and my hunting knife. I also packed a cooler with some sandwich meat, cheese, and a six-pack. I figured I'd sleep in, hike a bit, and maybe do some writing. I had a notebook full of half-started stories and thought the quiet would help me focus. The drive was uneventful. The turnoff was easy to miss. Just a rusty gate set back from the road with a small wooden sign that said Langston. I pushed the gate open and drove in. The gravel path was narrow and rough. Tall grass brushed against the sides of the truck as I crept forward. After maybe half a mile, the trees opened up and I saw it. The cemetery was off to the left, maybe 40 or 50 headstones behind an old iron fence. Some of the markers looked new. Others were so worn down you could barely read them. It was quiet, real quiet, not the peaceful kind either, more like the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. The cabin sat a short walk past the cemetery, right at the edge of a tree-line. It was a single-room structure with a tin roof, old wood siding, and a narrow porch with one rocking chair. There was no lock on the door. When I stepped inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. No furniture except for a cot against one wall, a small table with a kerosene lantern, and a shelf stacked with firewood and old books. The red tin mentioned in the text was right inside the door. I put 2 20s in it and shut the lid. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and unpacked a few things. There was a small fireplace and a few rusted pans hanging from nails. The windows had thick shutters that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. I spent most of that first afternoon wandering around the property. There wasn't much, just woods in every direction and the cemetery down the path. I didn't go into the cemetery. I figured I'd take a look the next day when the light was better. That night was cold. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and I had to light a fire in the fireplace just to keep warm. I sat on the floor reading until the fire burned low. I thought about the silence again. No distant cars, no barking dogs, not even crickets. Just the occasional pop from the fire and the groan of old wood shifting in the walls. I woke up around 2 a.m., not from a noise, but from the kind of stillness that feels off. I laid there for a while, staring at the ceiling. Something didn't feel right. My first thought was animals, raccoons, maybe deer, but the cabin was sealed up tight, and I hadn't left any food out. I got up and checked around with my flashlight. Nothing was out of place, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I stood on the porch for a few minutes and scanned the woods. The beam from the flashlight bounced off the trees but didn't catch anything. It was freezing, so I went back in and tried to sleep, but I kept hearing these dull, rhythmic sounds in the distance, like someone slowly knocking on wood. I told myself it was probably branches shifting in the wind, even though there wasn't much wind at all. Saturday morning, I walked to the cemetery. I figured daylight would make it feel less eerie. Didn't. The air was still heavy. Some of the graves dated back to the 1800s. One of them was marked Gr. Langston, the same name as the guy who posted the ad. The date was 1974 to 2003. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. If that was the guy who posted the listing, he'd been dead for over a decade. Maybe it was a relative. Maybe someone else used the name. I tried not to think too hard about it. That afternoon, I hiked around the property. There were trails, though they weren't well maintained. Around 2 miles out, I found a second path I hadn't seen before. It was narrow and overgrown, but I followed it anyway. After 10 minutes, I came across an old foundation, just the stone outline of what must have been a building at some point. Nearby, I found a pile of rusted tools, some broken bottles, and a few rotted boards. Looked like someone had tried to build something out there and gave up. I headed back before dark, ate a quick dinner, and stoked the fire. I noticed that my cooler was half empty. I was sure I hadn't eaten that much. I also noticed that one of my water jugs had been knocked over. I hadn't bumped it. I'm careful about that stuff, but I convinced myself maybe I had, or maybe the floor was uneven. That night, I woke again around 2 a.m. This time it wasn't just a feeling. I heard it, footsteps on the gravel path outside. Slow, deliberate. Crunch, crunch, pause. Then again. I froze. My hand went to the revolver under my pillow. I waited. The footsteps stopped outside the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For a full minute, there was nothing. Then I heard the faint creak of the porch floorboards. Just one. Then silence. I sat there until the sun started to rise. Never heard another sound. When I finally stepped outside, there were no tracks. The gravel looked untouched. But I know what I heard. Sunday morning, I was ready to go. I packed fast and didn't eat breakfast. I walked to the cemetery one last time just to make sure I wasn't losing it. That's when I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was a grave near the fence that hadn't been there before. The dirt was fresh.
No headstone.
Just a rectangle of turned earth. It looked like it had been dug the day before. I took a picture of it. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof. I felt sick. I got in the truck and drove out as fast as the road would let me. When I got to the gate, I stopped and got out to close it behind me. That's when I noticed something tucked under the latch. It was the $40 I'd left in the tin, folded in half. Nothing else, just the cash, crisp and dry like it had just come out of an ATM. I didn't report anything. Who would I tell? That I stayed in a cabin near a cemetery and someone walked around outside at night? That someone returned my money and maybe dug a grave while I slept? I went back to the online listing a few days later. It was gone. The number didn't work anymore either. I drove out to the road again about a month later. The gate was still there, but locked with a thick chain. No sign, no tire tracks, just weeds. I haven't gone back. I still think about it sometimes. Not because I want answers. I don't. I think about it because something about that place felt like it was waiting. Not haunted, not cursed, just patient. And I still wonder, who or what did I hear that night? And who was the new grave for? My name's Daniel, and I was 38 when all this happened. It was 2021, mid-autumn, and I had finally taken a break from the concrete life I'd been living in Manchester. I had always wanted to get away, just vanish into some quiet place, build something of my own, and breathe without car horns or sirens in the background. When my job shifted to full-time remote work, I figured I had my chance. So I packed up what I needed, loaded my small pickup with tools and supplies, and drove north toward the hills of rural Scotland. A friend of mine had a cousin who owned a small piece of land near the edge of Cairngorms National Park and agreed to let me stay there for a while. It was wild, quiet, far enough from civilization but not dangerously isolated. The land was thick with trees, damp moss everywhere, and an old hunting path that barely cut through the forest. I had scouted it earlier in the summer, planned out a small space just big enough for a single-room cabin. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a pitched roof, and a wood stove. I camped there a couple times and never ran into anyone, not even hikers. You had to know it was there to find it. It took me 2 days to clear the area again that October. Fallen branches, wet leaves, and a soft layer of mud from the earlier rains. I had driven my truck in as far as I could, then walked in the rest of the way with supplies. I brought only what I needed: wooden beams, tools, nails, tarp, a compact chainsaw, and food enough for a couple weeks. I had a tent set up while I worked, and I stayed out there alone. The rain started on the 5th night. Not a storm, just a steady, cold drizzle that made everything slick and slowed down the build. I had finished laying the base and was halfway through the frame. The forest around me turned darker than I'd expected. The kind of pitch black you only get when clouds cover the moon and trees surround you on all sides. Even with a lantern hung on a nearby post, it felt like I was working inside a tunnel. But I kept at it. I'd worked construction in my 20s. I knew how to frame walls and raise a roof. What I didn't expect was how eerie the woods would feel at night, especially in the rain. There was a silence I'd never known before. No cars.
No voices.
Just the steady patter of water on leaves and the occasional groan of tree limbs under their own weight. I wasn't scared exactly, but something was different. It didn't feel like the kind of silence that came from peace. It felt like the silence that follows noise, as if the forest was waiting for something. I kept working through it, mostly in the early mornings and late afternoons when the light was best. At night, I tried to stay dry under the tarp, eating canned soup and listening to the rain tap against the nylon. I had a small radio but couldn't get much signal. Sometimes I'd just sit there in my sleeping bag with a flashlight and read old camping manuals or scribble notes about the build. By the 2nd week, the rain hadn't let up for more than a day. The ground had turned into mush. I dug trenches around the perimeter to redirect the water, but it wasn't enough. My boots were soaked through every day, and I started to feel the wear in my back and knees. Still, the cabin was starting to take shape, walls up, roof halfway done, and windows framed. I could almost feel the shelter becoming real. Then something strange started happening. One morning, I found a small pile of rocks stacked neatly about 10 feet from the cabin. I hadn't put them there. They weren't just random stones either. They were placed carefully, in a kind of short spiral that curved inward like a snail shell. I figured maybe some hiker had passed through without me noticing, or maybe it was just some forest thing. Animals sometimes do weird stuff. I kicked them over and didn't think much of it. The next morning, they were back. Same spot, same pattern, wetter this time. I didn't feel threatened, but I was confused. I walked a half mile in every direction, calling out just to see if anyone was nearby. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of people. Just the endless sound of dripping water and the creaking of damp trees. The nights got colder. I hadn't built a proper door yet, just leaned a sheet of plywood against the frame. I stayed inside the cabin shell sometimes, lying on a foam mat with my sleeping bag, keeping a small fire in a metal barrel for warmth. That's when I started hearing the noises. Not animals. I know what foxes, deer, and even badgers sound like. This was different. It sounded like wood moving, snapping, not cracking naturally, but being stepped on. But always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Sometimes it was behind the cabin, sometimes along the treeline. I'd step outside with my flashlight, scan the woods, and there would be nothing but rain, fog, and the smell of wet pine. I started sleeping with my axe next to me. A few days later, I woke up around 3 a.m. The fire had died out. My flashlight battery was low, flickering, so I lit the lantern. I went outside to relieve myself and almost slipped in the mud. When I looked to the side of the cabin, I froze. There were footprints. Not boots, bare feet. Human, long and thin, and deep enough in the mud to be recent. They circled the cabin, passed close to my supplies, then led off toward the trees. No drag marks, no shoes, just 2 bare feet walking calmly around where I'd been sleeping. I followed them a little, but they disappeared into the wet moss beyond the slope. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside the shell of the cabin with the axe across my lap and the lantern hissing beside me. Every sound outside made me flinch. At some point, I dozed off, and when I woke up, the rain had stopped. That day, I tried to finish the roof. I told myself I was just tired, imagining things. Maybe the prints had been mine, even though I knew they weren't. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I hammered faster. I tried to drown everything out with work. That night, I slept in the tent again, zipped in tight. Just before I drifted off, I thought I heard something rustle just outside. I held my breath, heart pounding. Nothing happened. I forced myself to sleep. When I stepped outside in the morning, everything looked normal, until I got to the cabin. One of the wall panels was gone, just gone, pulled clean off. The nails scattered like someone had carefully pried it loose. I found it lying about 20 feet away, leaning against a tree. There were more footprints around the cabin now. Dozens.
All bore.
Some smaller, some wider. No tools were missing, but someone had taken a half bundle of firewood and left a pile of wet pine cones in its place. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I spent the next few hours gathering my gear, packing what I could, and covering the unfinished cabin with tarps. I couldn't carry everything, but I took my tools, food, and sleeping gear. I left a note on a sheet of plywood. "Will return. Please do not disturb." It felt ridiculous, but I wrote it anyway. I hiked out through the forest in the direction of the road. Took over an hour, and I kept checking behind me. Nothing followed me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the trees. Back at my truck, I drove straight to the nearest town, soaked and shaking. I rented a cheap room above a pub and spent the night drying out and trying to make sense of what had happened. No one at the bar had seen anything strange, though one older guy mentioned a rumor about quiet walkers who lived off-grid deep in the forests. He laughed when he said it, but I didn't. I didn't go back for weeks. I couldn't sleep right, couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, the wall, the pine cones. I checked the weather, waited for a stretch of dry days, and finally drove back up in mid-November. The forest was quieter then. The trees were more bare. When I reached the cabin site, everything looked untouched, but different. The cabin was still there. The tarps had been adjusted, tied down tighter than I'd left them. My note was gone. Inside, someone had finished part of the roof. Not all of it, just a section nailed in cleanly. My tools had been moved but were still there. The firewood stack was twice the size now, with more pine cones nearby. I stood there for a long time, then I left again. I never went back to build the cabin, but I did return one last time in the spring, just to see. The cabin was complete. Someone had finished it. Door, roof, even a small porch made from spare beams. Inside was empty, clean, dry, and still. I don't know who did it or why. I don't want to know. I never saw another footprint. No more rocks. No more pine cones. I just turned around, walked back to my truck, and drove home. Sometimes I think about that cabin. I still get the urge to disappear, to live in the quiet, to build something with my hands. But I don't go north anymore. I stay south, near people, near noise. Whoever finished that cabin, they didn't want me there, but they didn't destroy it. They just completed it. And that's enough of a message for me. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week alone up north, in a hunting cabin that used to belong to my Uncle Paul. He passed away in 2019, and the place sat untouched since then. It was built deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, off a barely visible dirt road about 2 hours north of Ironwood. A few people in my family had gone there for hunting or fishing over the years, but no one had set foot in it since Paul died. He was a quiet man, didn't care for company, and preferred long weeks out in the woods, alone with his thoughts and his rifle. I think I inherited that same kind of need to be alone sometimes, especially after the past few months. My relationship had ended, I'd quit my job, and I just felt like I needed a reset. I figured a week in that old cabin would be the perfect way to clear my head. Just me, the forest, and my rifle. It was the end of October, 2022. The weather had already started to turn. The leaves were almost all down, and a thin layer of frost clung to the grass in the mornings. Cold, quiet, and empty, just the way I wanted it. I drove up in my old silver Tacoma, loaded with gear. Rifle, ammunition, a cooler with food, propane for the heater, and a small generator in case I needed power. The place didn't have running water, but there was a creek nearby for washing up, and I brought a few gallons of drinking water. Everything I needed was packed tight in the back. The last 5 miles of the drive were on rough dirt roads. I had to go slow, weaving around potholes and fallen branches. When I reached the cabin, it looked just like I remembered it. Small, square, with dark brown planks of weathered wood and a slanted tin roof. A metal chimney jutted up one side. A single porch light was above the door, though I had no idea if it still worked. I parked the truck about 10 feet from the door and got out. The air was cold and dry. It smelled like pine needles and dead leaves. No sounds, no wind, no birds, just that deep forest stillness that makes you feel like the whole world paused. Inside, the cabin was dusty but solid. One room, maybe 15 feet wide, with a small kitchen area to the left, a wood-burning stove in the far corner, and a bunk on the right wall. There was a wooden table and 2 old chairs in the middle, and shelves full of canned food, most of which had expired years ago. I set up my gear, got the heater running, and cracked a window to air the place out. That first night was quiet. I didn't sleep much, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I was too used to city sounds. The silence in the woods at night can feel loud if you're not used to it. Every creak in the roof or groan of the wood made me stop and listen. But eventually I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early and set out with my rifle. The frost was thick on the ground, and my breath puffed white in the air. I followed a game trail I remembered from years ago, heading out past the creek and deeper into the woods. I didn't see much that first day. A few fresh tracks, but no movement. Still, it felt good to be out there. No phone, no people, just trees and time. I came back around noon, made a quick meal, and spent the afternoon chopping firewood and scouting new spots. The sun dropped fast that time of year, and by 5:30 it was already getting dark. I made a fire in the stove, heated up some canned stew, and sat with my back to the wall, watching the shadows move as the flames flickered. That night, I heard something outside. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I was half asleep in my sleeping bag when I heard the sound of something stepping on the porch. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. You know the sound a boot makes on dry wood? That's what it sounded like. One step, then another. I sat up, heart hammering, and grabbed my rifle. I waited, holding my breath. Another step, then silence. I didn't move for almost an hour. I kept the barrel of the rifle pointed at the door and didn't blink. I never heard anything else. No walking away, no rustling. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself maybe it was a branch or something falling. Maybe even a big animal. I forced myself to lay back down, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside. There were boot prints in the frost, clear as day, Someone had walked up to the porch, taken 3 steps, and then nothing. No prints going away. Just a trail that stopped right there at the 3rd step, like the person had vanished. I followed the prints backward into the trees. They went on for maybe 20 yards, then curved off toward the creek. I kept going, moving slow, eyes scanning the brush. That's when I found the first cigarette. A still burning cigarette, but just barely smoldering in the grass. Fresh. No snow or frost on it. Someone had been there that morning, maybe just an hour or 2 before. I turned around, slowly, looking into the woods. Nothing, just trees and silence. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and kept my rifle close. I told myself it was probably just a hiker, maybe someone who knew the cabin was here and wanted to check it out. But something felt wrong. This place was miles from the nearest road, and there were no trailheads nearby. No one just stumbles across it. I stayed inside the rest of the day. Didn't hunt, didn't leave. Just watched through the windows, listening. Nothing happened. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every creak felt like footsteps. But the night passed quietly. The next morning, I almost left. I stood outside, staring at the truck, thinking about packing up. But part of me didn't want to. This trip was supposed to be a break from all the noise, and I didn't want to run away because of something that might have just been nothing. I stayed. That afternoon, I went out again. I took the rifle and followed the creek for a while, hoping to see some deer. It was cold, and the wind picked up a bit, rustling the dead leaves. I kept checking behind me, paranoid, but I didn't see anyone. Then I found the second sign. A plastic bag tied to a tree branch, about 6 feet off the ground. Inside the bag was a half-eaten sandwich and a folded-up paper napkin. It was fresh, definitely not something that had been sitting out. The bread was soft. The meat didn't smell yet. It was like someone had just eaten it. I left it where it was and backed away slowly. Back at the cabin, I locked the door again and checked all the windows. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, wrapped in my sleeping bag, rifle in my lap. Around midnight, I heard it again. Steps outside. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I didn't move. I just listened. My mouth was dry. My heart felt like it was trying to climb up my throat. The steps circled again. Then silence. Then something scraped the wall, like a knife or maybe a stick, dragging along the wooden planks. Slow. From the back of the cabin to the window near the bed. I didn't dare look. I just aimed the rifle at the window and waited. Eventually, the sound stopped. I sat there until the sun came up. When I finally stepped outside, I found more footprints. The same boots, deep, clear, fresh. And on the back wall of the cabin, long scrape marks. Whatever had been dragged along the wood left gouges almost half an inch deep. I packed my things. There was no more trying to rationalize it. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, maybe messing with me, maybe worse. I didn't want to wait to find out. As I loaded up the truck, I kept looking into the trees. I felt eyes on me the whole time, and then I saw him, just for a second, maybe 50 yards away. A man, standing still between 2 trees, dressed in dark clothing, hood up, arms at his sides. Not moving, just staring. I didn't aim the rifle. I didn't shout. I didn't do anything but climb into the truck and start it. I backed out, turned around, and drove faster than I should have down that old dirt road. The tires slipped a few times in the loose gravel, but I didn't slow down. Not until I hit pavement 2 hours later. I drove all the way to a motel just outside of Duluth and spent the night there. I didn't sleep much, just laid there thinking about those boot prints, that sandwich, that cigarette, the scraping sound. I never reported it. What could I say? No one was hurt. Nothing was stolen. I had no proof. Just a feeling in my gut that if I'd stayed one more night, something would have gone very wrong. I haven't been back to the cabin since. A few months later, I looked it up on a map, curious. I zoomed out, scanned the area. About 5 miles south of the cabin, hidden in the woods near an old, barely visible fire road, was a marker for a missing person. A hiker, disappeared in 2020, never found. That stuck with me. I don't know if it was connected. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I was just unlucky. Or maybe I was lucky I got out when I did. But I know this. I wasn't alone out there. And whoever was watching, they didn't want me there. I still go hunting, but never alone. And never in the Upper Peninsula again. That trip changed something in me. It reminded me that the woods aren't always empty, that people can be worse than anything you imagine. And sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't a bear or a wolf. Sometimes, it's the man who watches from the trees and never says a word. I was 53 the year Claire died. We had been divorced almost 6 years by then, but her passing still hit something in me. Not in a romantic way. I don't want to pretend we were still close or that her death shattered my world. But there was a strange weight to it, like a piece of my past that had just been sealed off forever. And now I was the only one left holding the memories. She had died in a car crash somewhere in northern Utah. Some drunk kid ran a red light late at night and T-boned her on the driver's side. They said it was quick.
No suffering.
That part stuck with me more than I expected. We hadn't talked in over a year, and the last time we did, it was cold and distant, mostly about some mail I had mistakenly received. She had kept the cabin. It was this small place out near Twin Bridges, Montana. We bought it when we were still married, back when we thought getting away from the noise and the city would fix us. The place didn't even have a proper address, just a long, unpaved road that led off a county route and stopped dead in a clearing. We hadn't been there together in over 10 years. After the divorce, Claire got the cabin. She liked it more than I did anyway, and I wasn't about to fight over something that just reminded me of long, silent weekends and burned casseroles. But she kept it up as far as I knew. Visited it every few months, fixed the deck, replaced the siding. I think she even had a neighbor check in on it during the winters. After she died, her sister Ellen reached out to tell me she was handling the estate. Claire hadn't updated her will since before the divorce, so technically, the cabin reverted back to me. I didn't want it. I didn't even think about it. But Ellen was adamant that I should at least come see it one last time. Maybe decide what to do with it. I figured I could drive up there, spend a couple of nights, and either list it for sale or sign it over to someone who gave a damn. I had a week off work and not much else going on. It was the end of August, the air was still warm, and the roads would be clear. I packed up my truck and headed out, not thinking much beyond what gas stations I'd stop at on the way. The drive took longer than I remembered. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, and finally just ruts carved into the forest floor. Trees closed in tight on either side, tall and thick. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. I had to slow to a crawl for the last few miles. My tires kicked up dust and small stones, the truck bumping over roots and patches of grass. When I pulled up to the clearing, it all came back at once. The cabin sat hunched in the middle of a patch of tall yellow grass. The wood was darker than I remembered, weathered by sun and wind. The deck looked newer, maybe replaced a few years ago. The windows were all intact, curtains drawn tight. The same little metal chimney poked out of the roof. It looked lonely, like a forgotten photograph in a box you never meant to open again. I shut off the engine and just sat there for a few minutes. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind, no bugs even. I stepped out of the truck, stretched, and grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat. The door creaked when I pushed it open. It had always done that. Inside, not much had changed. A coat of dust covered everything, but it didn't smell too musty. There were 2 small couches along the walls, a coffee table in between, and a wood stove in the corner. The kitchen was still cramped and ugly, with a yellowed fridge and stained counters. A hallway led to the single bedroom and bathroom in the back. I found myself checking for something of hers, but there wasn't much. A few books on the shelf, some old mugs, a worn-out throw blanket. The fridge was empty, unplugged. The place was cold and still, but not uncomfortable. Just untouched. I spent the first night on the couch, too lazy to make the bed. I drank a few beers I had brought and read through an old journal she had left behind. Nothing juicy, mostly lists and thoughts and reminders. Grocery stuff, maintenance tasks. There was an entry from 3 months ago about a raccoon tearing up the porch. She had tried to trap it, but it kept outsmarting her. It was around midnight when I thought I heard a sound outside, a soft thud, maybe an animal. I stood by the window for a while, peeking through the curtains. Nothing, just darkness and trees. The next morning, I walked around the property. The grass was taller than I liked, so I found an old rusted blade in the shed and tried to chop it down a bit. I cleared the porch steps, checked the gutters, and made a list of what needed fixing. The railing on the back deck was loose. The screen door stuck. A couple of the planks on the roof overhang were starting to rot. I found a trail behind the cabin that I had completely forgotten about. It led down a slight slope into a thicker part of the woods, toward a dried-up creek bed. Claire and I used to hike there. I followed it for a bit just to stretch my legs. At the bend, I saw something odd. There were tire tracks, faint but definitely there. Not fresh, but not old either. I crouched and touched the dirt. No rain lately, so they could have been a few weeks old. Maybe a neighbor had come by. But the thing was, this trail wasn't connected to any road. It was a hiking path. You couldn't drive a car down here unless you had something small, like a quad. I didn't think much more of it, just logged it in my head. Maybe the neighbor had an ATV. That night, I went to bed early, but couldn't sleep. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like movement outside. Not an animal this time, more deliberate. Footsteps on dry leaves. I stayed still. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I didn't want to move, didn't want to breathe too loudly. The noise stopped. I got up eventually, crept to the window and looked out. Nothing. The next day, I searched the perimeter.
No prints. No trash disturbed.
Nothing knocked over. It was like I had imagined it. But I know I didn't. I stayed a third night. That was a mistake. I woke up again in the middle of the night, but this time to a scraping sound. Metal against wood. I shot up from the bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. I clicked it on and moved to the living room. The sound had stopped. I pointed the light at the front door. It was closed, locked. Then I noticed something through the side window. A faint shape, someone walking away through the trees. I ran to the door and yanked it open, flashlight bouncing wildly across the clearing. The shape was gone. I stepped off the porch, shining the beam side to side. Then I saw it. On the ground, near the porch steps. An old wire trap, the kind used to snare raccoons. The same kind Claire had written about. Only now it was empty. The door had been bent slightly, and beside it, a torn piece of fabric. A dark blue sleeve, canvas material, maybe from a jacket. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed my bag, locked the cabin, and drove into town. I found a hardware store and bought a trail cam, one of those small, motion-activated ones used by hunters. I drove back, found a tree near the cabin facing the clearing, and strapped it up. I wanted proof, either of an animal or of someone. That night, I kept a hatchet beside my bed. Nothing happened. The next morning, I checked the camera. One picture, time-stamped at 3:12 a.m. It was a man, Thin, tall, in a hooded jacket, standing near the porch, just standing, staring at the door. I didn't even finish my coffee. I packed everything again, threw it in the truck, and left. Drove straight to the sheriff's office in Dillon. I told them what happened. They took the SD card and asked me a few questions. Said they'd check with nearby properties, maybe increase patrols. But here's the part that stuck with me. They recognized him. Apparently, the guy had been squatting out in the woods for over a year. No ID, no permanent address. Lived in an old trailer someone abandoned deep in the forest. Not violent, but paranoid. Kept to himself. They tried to catch him a few times, but he always vanished before they got there. They said Claire had filed a report about him last spring. Said someone had broken into the shed and stolen some tools. They never caught him. I stayed in a motel that night. The next day, I signed the papers and transferred the cabin to Ellen. She said she'd have it torn down eventually, maybe sell the land to someone local. I haven't been back since, but sometimes I still think about her and that man, and how maybe, just maybe, she had more trouble with him than she let on. Maybe she didn't want to burden anyone. Maybe that was why she kept going back. To scare him off, to reclaim her space. And maybe she lost that fight long before the crash. The cabin's gone now. I checked. Bulldozed a few months later. The land's empty, and no one's built anything on it. But that trail is still there, and so are the trees. And if you ever walk that way and see tire tracks or hear a noise in the night, just remember, not everything lost in the woods is looking to be found. Some of it's just hiding, watching, waiting. It was October 2019 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Arizona. I was 27 back then, burned out from work, living in Phoenix, barely sleeping and pretty much running on caffeine and stress. My Uncle Frank passed away earlier that year, and he'd left the cabin to my dad. My dad never had time for it, and neither did I, but something about that year just made me want to get away. I wanted quiet. I wanted air that didn't smell like city fumes. So I packed up my truck, threw in some camping supplies, a cooler full of food, a rifle, and my dog Ranger, and made the 5-hour drive up through the winding roads into the forests past Flagstaff. The cabin was about 12 miles off the main road, down a narrow dirt trail that cut through thick ponderosa pine. You wouldn't know it was there unless someone told you. No cell service out that way, of course. No power lines.
No neighbors.
Just you, the trees, and whatever walked through them. The cabin itself was a small one-bedroom structure with faded red siding and a rusted metal roof. It had a wood-burning stove, a single bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and some leftover hunting gear in the corner. There was an outhouse about 30 feet behind the place, and a shed with old tools just to the right. The cabin had stood there for at least 40 years, maybe more. My uncle used it mostly for hunting elk and deer, but he'd also told my dad that the place gave him the creeps at night sometimes. He never got specific, and we all thought he was just spooked by being out there alone. I arrived just after noon on a Wednesday. The sky was clear, and the air felt cooler than Phoenix. The pine smell was strong, and I could hear nothing but the wind moving through the branches and the occasional creak of the old wooden boards as I walked across the porch. I unlocked the door, let Ranger sniff around, and started unpacking. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked a bit during the day, took notes in a journal I brought, cooked over the fire pit out front, and slept early. Ranger loved it out there. He'd run through the brush chasing squirrels, barking at shadows in the trees, but never wandering too far. On the 3rd night, something changed. It was a little after 9, and I was inside reading by lantern light. Ranger had been lying near the door, half asleep. The stove was going, and the air inside was warm and dry. I had just started to doze off when Ranger suddenly perked up, his ears straight, body stiff. Then he growled. It wasn't a bark. It was that low rumble dogs do when something's off. He stared at the door. I turned off the lantern, sat up quietly, and listened. The fire in the stove crackled softly. Outside, I couldn't hear anything at first, but then I did. Footsteps, not animal footsteps, not the scamper of a raccoon or the crunch of a deer moving through the brush. These were slow, deliberate steps, 2 feet heavy, the kind of walk you only hear from a person. I grabbed my rifle, stood near the window, and peeked out. The moon was bright enough to light up the trees, but I didn't see anyone. Ranger stayed dead silent, growling under his breath, his eyes locked on the door. I waited for a long time. The footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went out and looked around the cabin.
No footprints.
The ground was dry, covered in pine needles, and I couldn't tell if anything had been disturbed. I figured maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was on edge from being alone. Still, I kept my rifle close the rest of the day. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, slower. I could hear them circling the cabin. Ranger went wild, barking and scratching at the door. I opened the window just enough to point the rifle out, shouted, but got no reply. Then I heard something out by the shed, a metal clank, like a tool being knocked over. I turned the lantern back off and waited. The noise stopped. Ranger kept pacing in circles, barking toward the back window. After maybe 15 minutes, everything went quiet again. I barely slept, lying on the bed with the rifle across my lap, staring at the door. In the morning, I checked the shed. The door was open. I knew I had closed it. Inside, a few tools had been knocked over. A handsaw lay on the floor, like someone had picked it up and dropped it. I looked around the cabin again, walking in wide circles, trying to find footprints or anything out of place. Still nothing clear, but I knew I wasn't alone out there. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to feel like I was running from something. I told myself it might have been a drifter or a hunter passing through, so I stayed. That night, it got worse. I was sitting by the fire pit around 8 p.m., eating from a can of beans when Ranger growled again. He stood and looked toward the trees. I followed his gaze. Something was there, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden between the trunks. I saw it move, not an animal. It was a person, tall, thin. I couldn't see their face, but they were just standing there, watching. I called out, said I was armed. No answer. The figure ducked behind a tree and vanished into the darkness. I grabbed the lantern, pulled Ranger inside, and locked the door. I stacked a chair against it just in case. Then I killed the light, sat on the floor with my rifle, and waited. Around midnight, the tapping started. Soft taps on the walls. First on the left side, then the back. Not fast, just slow, deliberate taps, like someone dragging a finger or a stick across the siding. Ranger barked so loud I thought he'd blow out his lungs. I looked out the window again but saw nothing. I waited with my back against the wall, listening to the sounds move around the cabin. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I was done. I packed what I could, shoved my gear back in the truck, loaded Ranger up, and planned to leave. But when I turned the ignition, the truck wouldn't start. Battery was fine. Tank had fuel. But when I turned the key, it just clicked. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked what I could, but I'm no mechanic. Something was wrong. It had been working fine the day before. I got out my satellite beacon just in case, but even that was dead. I had checked the batteries the day I left. They were good. Now it was just blank. Felt too perfect. Like someone had done something, disconnected something, or worse. I decided to stay one more night, keep the fire going, wait until morning, and hike the 12 miles to the main road if I had to. I kept the rifle loaded, every door and window locked. At dusk, I heard something new, a whistle, 3 sharp notes coming from the trees. Not a bird call, not wind. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention. Then again, from a different direction. It was like they were surrounding me. Ranger was going insane. He paced the cabin, barking toward every wall. I closed the shutters, pulled a blanket over the window, and waited with my back to the stove. I didn't hear footsteps that night. I didn't hear tapping, but I knew someone was out there, watching, waiting. The whistling continued every hour or so, like a signal. At one point, around 3 a.m., I swear I heard a voice. Not words, just a sound. A broken, almost human sound, like someone trying to mimic speech without actually knowing how. I didn't move. I just kept the rifle pointed at the door and prayed for the sun. When daylight finally came, I didn't waste time. I grabbed Ranger, threw on my pack, and we started walking. 12 miles through the forest, rifle slung over my shoulder, checking behind me every few minutes. I never saw them, never heard them, but I knew they were there, watching. I could feel it. When I got back to the main road, I flagged down a trucker who let me use his phone. We called for a tow and got the truck back to Flagstaff. The mechanic said someone had pulled out 2 ignition wires and damaged the starter. Said it looked intentional. I never told him about the cabin. Never went back. A few weeks later, I looked up stories from that area. Found posts from hikers and hunters saying they'd seen strange people in the woods. People who didn't respond when called out. Who watched from a distance but never came close. Locals sometimes blamed it on skinwalkers, old Navajo legends, but I don't believe in that stuff. I believe it was just someone living out there. Someone who didn't want me there. Someone who'd learned how to stay hidden. It wasn't a monster or a demon, just a person. But that's what made it worse. I never spent a night alone in the woods again. It was September 2019 when I decided to take some time off and spend a few days alone in the woods. I was 32 back then, still working security for a warehouse in northern Indiana, the kind of job that paid okay but wore you down slowly. That month had been rough. A couple co-workers had gotten fired, we were short-staffed, and I'd been pulling graveyard shifts 5 nights a week. I felt like I hadn't seen the sun in weeks. I'd rented a small cabin near a place called Brown Hollow, not far from Bloomington. The place wasn't anything fancy, just a square with structure tucked into a quiet patch of forest, with 1 small bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a front porch that overlooked the tree line. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, barely any signal. That's exactly why I chose it. I brought my own food, a cooler full of beer, and a few paperbacks I hadn't gotten around to reading. I even brought my old camera. I figured I'd hike around during the day and just sit by the fire at night. Nothing complicated. No schedule. No people. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I barely heard a car. Didn't see a single soul. Just squirrels hopping across the porch and the occasional deer out by the trees. The air smelled clean, and the nights were dead quiet, except for crickets and owls. I slept better than I had in months. It was on the 3rd morning that things started to feel off. I was out back, cutting some kindling near the fire pit, when I heard an engine in the distance. It wasn't unusual to hear a truck pass down the gravel access road, but this one stopped. I walked around to the front and saw a dark green SUV parked just off the driveway. Government plates. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe park rangers or something. But then I saw the man who stepped out. He looked like a cop or maybe a sheriff, tall, built like a linebacker, wearing tan tactical pants and a dark brown button-up with a badge clipped near the chest. No name tag I could see. He had a sidearm and a radio, and he moved slow, like someone who didn't worry about being watched. I stayed back near the porch steps, waiting to see if he needed something. He just looked around for a while like he was surveying the place. Then he nodded to himself and walked back toward the SUV. I figured maybe he was checking properties for vandalism or something. It made sense, I guess. But something about the way he looked at the cabin stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I went for a hike through the woods behind the cabin. There were a couple of old trails, mostly overgrown but walkable. I was maybe 2 miles out when I saw fresh tire tracks near a clearing. I hadn't noticed them the day before. I didn't think much of it until I saw boot prints, the kind that matched what the guy earlier had been wearing. I figured he'd maybe driven out here too, though I wasn't sure why he'd park so deep in the woods. I decided to turn back early. The rest of the day was uneventful. But when night came, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. It was quiet, too quiet. I slept with a flashlight on the nightstand. The next morning, I went to grab firewood off the pile I stacked near the shed out back. That's when I noticed something else. A footprint, fresh, right next to the shed door. The dirt was soft from the rain the night before, and the tread was clear, same kind of boot. I didn't like that. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, hadn't posted anything online. I'd paid for the cabin in cash through a listing I found on a local bulletin board at a gas station. No one should have known I was here. I didn't have cell service, and the nearest ranger station was probably 20 minutes away if you drove fast. I considered leaving that day, but I talked myself out of it. I still had food, and maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a hiker or someone checking the property lines. That night, I heard the crunch of footsteps outside. It was sometime after midnight. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard leaves moving outside the window. I turned off the lantern and sat still. The steps were slow, careful. Whoever it was didn't want to be heard. They circled around the cabin. I heard a soft creak near the porch. I reached for the hunting knife I kept in my duffel and waited. Minutes passed.
No knock.
No engine starting. Just silence again. I barely slept the rest of the night. The first light, I checked outside. Nothing stolen, no signs of forced entry. But someone had definitely been out there. I saw more boot prints, this time near the back window. Same ones. That morning, I decided I was leaving. I packed up most of my things, loaded the car, and planned to be gone by noon. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The car didn't start. Battery was fine. Lights came on. But the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood. Everything looked normal until I saw the fuel line, cleanly cut. I knew right then someone didn't want me leaving. I went back inside, locked the doors, and started planning. There was an old map in one of the drawers. I figured I'd hike out to a nearby ranger tower marked about 4 miles southeast. It would take a couple hours, but I'd make it before dark. I packed water, some jerky, and a flashlight just in case. I never made it a mile. I'd only been walking for about 20 minutes when I heard the snap of a branch up ahead. I froze, crouched low, and waited. I saw movement between the trees, just a shape at first, then clearer. It was him, the same man from the SUV. He was walking slow, scanning the trees like he was looking for something or someone. He hadn't seen me yet. I waited until he passed behind a thick pine and then turned back. I moved fast, quietly, retracing my steps to the cabin. When I got there, I locked the doors again and shoved a chair under the knob. I didn't know what else to do. There was no phone, no radio, just me and a knife. The hours dragged. I sat near the window with the shades drawn, waiting for night. Every sound outside made my heart jump. Around sunset, I saw his SUV parked just off the driveway again. He stood in the yard for a long time, just staring at the cabin. He had something in his hand this time, a long crowbar or maybe a pry tool. I thought about confronting him, but something told me not to. This wasn't official business. He wasn't acting like someone doing a check. He was hunting. He circled the cabin again after dark, tapping at the windows. He never said a word. Just slow, careful steps, like he wanted me to know he was there but didn't want to rush anything. At some point, he left. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the woods again.
No SV. No footprints.
I thought maybe he gave up, maybe it was over. I even started walking toward the trail again, thinking I could still make it to the ranger tower. That's when I saw the shallow pit behind the shed. It was about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, freshly dug. A shovel leaned nearby. That was when the real fear hit me, not just paranoia or discomfort. This was premeditated. He'd been watching, waiting. Maybe he'd done this before. I went back inside and blocked every door. That day was a blur. I kept thinking about the fuel line, the footprints, the pit. Whoever he was, he had power, a badge. And he was out here, far from anyone who'd question him. That night, he came back. I heard the SUV long before I saw it. Headlights off, just the quiet hum of tires on gravel. I was already sitting in the corner of the kitchen with the knife and a fire poker. I'd blocked the doors with furniture. The window shades were down, but I left one corner slightly open so I could see. He walked straight to the back door and tried the handle. Then he stepped back and kicked it hard. The first hit cracked the frame. The second one broke it. He stepped inside, slow and steady, sweeping the flashlight across the kitchen. That's when I saw the pistol in his hand. I didn't think. I lunged at him from the side, slashing with the knife. He fired once, missed, and I tackled him into the counter. We struggled. I grabbed the pistol, yanked it down, and we both hit the floor. He tried to roll on top of me, but I smashed the fire poker across his head. He went limp. I didn't wait. I grabbed his pistol, ran to the SUV, and drove until I hit pavement. I made it to a fire station about an hour away. I told them everything. I showed them the cabin, the pit, the broken door, the cut fuel line. The man's name was Deputy Gerald Klein. He'd been with the Monroe County Sheriff's Department for 16 years. No major complaints.
No investigations.
But when they searched his house, they found a drawer full of IDs, driver's licenses, camping permits, car keys. None of them were his. They found a notebook, too. Lists of remote properties, cabins, and dates. Pattern. He hadn't been working in any official capacity. He was doing this on his own, using his badge as a shield. I never went back to that cabin. I moved 2 months later, left Indiana altogether. I still work security, but I stay in the city now. Cameras, people, lights. I still see him sometimes, his face, in dreams or when I close my eyes too long. He wasn't a monster or a ghost, just a man with power and no fear of consequences. That's what makes it worse. He wore a badge and he buried graves before he had victims. And he almost got away with it. I was 35 the year I took that trip, and I still wonder what made me go through with it. Maybe it was the burnout from work. Maybe it was the quiet breakdown I'd been hiding from friends and family. Or maybe I just needed to feel something real. I'd been living in Chicago for the past 10 years, working in IT for a logistics company, stuck in a loop of screen time, traffic, and city noise. That year, I had a small inheritance from my uncle's estate. Just enough to cover some time off work and something different. So I drove out to Idaho. I didn't know anyone there, hadn't been before, but I saw some pictures of the Salmon Chalice National Forest online. Wide open wilderness, cabins you could rent, lakes that looked untouched by anything modern. Felt right. I wanted quiet. I didn't want to see people for a while.
No phones. No emails.
Just trees, mountains, air. I booked a small hunting cabin listed on some obscure website. It wasn't on Airbnb or any well-known rental site, just a listing on a forum, posted by a guy who went by the name RC82. He said he maintained a few cabins up in the northern part of Lemhi County, not far from a ghost town called Gilmore. It was off-grid, no electricity or running water, but had a wood stove, rain barrel, and solar light strips. It was cheap. The drive up from Boise took nearly 7 hours. The last 2 were rough, winding dirt roads that kept getting thinner and rockier as I climbed. I had an old Subaru, and it handled the terrain okay, but there were a few times I had to stop and clear fallen branches or rocks out of the path. I saw maybe 1 or 2 other trucks the whole time. The cabin was better than I expected, nothing fancy, but sturdy. It sat in a small clearing backed by tall pines, with a small creek about 50 feet downhill. The front porch faced west, giving me a clear view of the tree line and the rolling hills beyond it. Inside was a cot with some old wool blankets, a rusted-out wood stove, a folding table, and a couple of chairs. There were some canned goods and dry staples in the cupboards: rice, beans, powdered milk, sardines. I brought my own supplies too, just in case. I got there in early September. The days were still warm, but the nights dipped low. It was quiet, dead quiet.
No angines, no uming actini units, no buisas.
Just wind in the trees, bird calls, and sometimes the snap of a branch far off. I set up a routine, waking early, boiling water on the stove, going for long hikes through the woods, reading old paperbacks I brought, then cooking in the evening and sitting on the porch until it got too cold. I didn't see anyone that first week. No signs of people either. I left my phone turned off and only used my small satellite radio once to send a check-in ping. It was perfect, until it wasn't. The first weird thing was the noise. It happened on the 9th night, just after midnight. I was in the cot, wrapped in 2 blankets and half asleep when I heard something outside. A snap, then another. Not branches falling, footsteps. Slow, heavy steps. At first, I figured it was an elk or maybe a bear, but the pattern was wrong. Bears move heavy, sure, but not in that slow, pacing way. This was rhythmic. Someone walking. I sat up and didn't move, listening hard. It went quiet for a few minutes. Then I heard something bump against the porch steps. Just one tap. I had a knife under my cot. I didn't have a gun. Should have brought one, but I hadn't planned on needing it. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I waited maybe 10 minutes before I got up and peeked through the boarded window. Nothing. Just trees and moonlight. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I walked the perimeter. I found a few broken branches, but no prints. The ground was too dry and hard for tracks. I chalked it up to my imagination or maybe some animal curiosity. But I started locking the door at night and kept the knife closer. Then, 2 days later, something else happened. I had gone out hiking around noon and made it back just before dusk. When I opened the cabin door, I knew right away something was wrong. My food bin had been moved. I always kept it under the table, strapped shut. Now it was sitting on top of the table, unlatched. A few of the canned goods were stacked neatly on the shelf. My pack was unzipped. Not ransacked, almost carefully handled. Nothing taken, just touched. I didn't see any footprints. No handprints on the windows or doors. But I felt it. Someone had been inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the window, knife on my lap, straining my ears. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time, closer. Someone walked right up to the porch. I heard a soft creak as the boards flexed. Then a pause. Then the sound of something lightly scraping along the outside wall, like nails or metal. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then it stopped. No retreating footsteps, just silence. The next morning, I checked outside. There were no fresh prints, no marks on the door, but on the side of the cabin, just below the window, I saw them. 5 long, parallel scratches running down the wood, maybe 4 inches deep, like someone dragged a rake or claws down the wall. But the spacing was off, too close for bear claws. It looked a human. That was the day I decided to leave early. I packed my gear fast, ignoring the food. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. But when I got to the car, my stomach dropped. The front tires had been slashed. Deep, clean cuts straight across the sidewalls. I looked around the clearing, heart racing, but saw no one. It was broad daylight, but I felt exposed, like someone was watching. I backed up against the car, knife out, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The nearest town was over 15 miles away, and the first 7 were just forest road. No signal. I knew I had to hike out. I loaded my pack with water, food, a flashlight, and the knife, and I started moving fast down the trail. I didn't look back. I made it 5 miles before I found the tarp. It was strung up between 2 trees, low to the ground, like a makeshift lean-to. Underneath it were bones. Small animal bones, maybe rabbit or squirrel, scattered around a rusted camp stove and some old pots. Nearby was a plastic jug filled with yellow water, a moldy backpack, and a pile of tattered clothing. Men's jeans torn up and stained, some boots, a shredded hoodie, and a rope, thick, coiled rope with knots tied every foot or so. My mouth went dry. I didn't touch anything. I just kept going. Around dusk, I stopped to rest on a ridge that overlooked the valley below. I thought I was alone. I was wrong. Across the gap, maybe 100 yards away, I saw movement in the trees. A figure, dressed in dark clothes, standing completely still between 2 pines, just watching. I didn't move. The wind pushed branches around, but the figure didn't budge. Then it stepped back into the woods and disappeared. I ran. I don't know how long or how far, but by the time I stopped, it was fully dark. I had no idea where I was, just somewhere deep in the forest, probably off the trail. I tried to calm down, drank water, then kept walking through the night. I reached a gravel road around 4 a.m. I followed it until sunrise, and around 9, I found a ranger station. I told them my car had broken down and that I needed help. I didn't mention the cabin or the man or the bones. I didn't want to deal with questions or paperwork. I just wanted to be gone. They gave me a ride to town. I booked a motel room, slept for 16 hours, and caught a bus the next day. When I got back to Chicago, I quit my job a week later. I didn't tell anyone why, just said I needed a break. For a long time, I couldn't sleep. Every little creak or sound outside would jolt me awake. I kept knives by my bed, even carried pepper spray for a while. I looked up the listing for that cabin again. The forum was gone. RC82 never replied to my emails. A few months later, I saw a short local article buried in an online Idaho news site. Hiker found dead near Gilmore. Body partially decomposed. No ID. They thought he'd been out there for months. They said foul play wasn't ruled out. I know it wasn't the same guy I saw in the woods. That hiker had been dead long before I got there. So who was walking around the cabin? I don't know. I don't want to know. I never went back. It was early October 2018 when I decided to take a break from the usual rhythm of my life. I had just turned 33 a few weeks earlier, and after years of working as a freelance editor from home, I felt like I was starting to lose the sense of seasons, of places, of normal human pace. I needed something slower, quieter, and away from people. So I rented a cabin in the Scottish Highlands for a week. The place was listed on a simple, no-frills site that advertised off-the-grid getaways. Cabins, cottages, shepherd's huts. I wasn't looking for luxury, just somewhere quiet where I could disconnect. The one I booked was an old timber cabin on the edge of a pine forest near a place called Dalmally in Argyll. It was far from towns or traffic, sitting by itself with no neighbors in sight. The description said it had wood heat, a solar battery for a few lights, and a stream nearby for water. It was exactly what I was after. I took the train from Edinburgh to Oban, then hired a small car and drove inland, winding through narrow, hilly roads until I finally turned off onto a gravel track that led deep into the woods. The road was rough, overgrown in parts, with bracken spilling over from both sides. The air was damp, and you could smell pine needles and wet earth. Eventually, after nearly a mile of that single-lane track, I saw the cabin. It wasn't large, just one main room with a small side area for a bathroom and an outdoor compost toilet behind it. The walls were grayed from years of weather, and the windows were old glass that distorted the light slightly. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it. The door stuck a bit, and the inside smelled like cold wood smoke and old paper. There was a wood stove in the corner, a pile of chopped logs stacked neatly along one wall, a single bed against another, and a small table under the window with 2 chairs. I dropped my backpack and took a slow walk around the place. Behind the cabin, the trees grew thicker. There was a small path leading down to the stream mentioned in the listing. I didn't see any signs of recent visitors, and no tire tracks aside from my own. It felt good to be out there. Quiet, no phone signal, just the wind moving through the pine branches and the occasional call of a raven overhead. That first day passed slowly. I read a bit, took a nap in the late afternoon, then lit the wood stove once the temperature dropped. Took me a while to figure out the draft, but eventually I had a good fire going. I cooked some food over the flame, cans of stew, tea boiled on the metal top, and then sat outside for a while in the dark with a blanket over my shoulders. The stars were out in force, no light pollution anywhere, just the quiet of the forest and the crack of branches now and then. Normal forest noises. The second day, I took a longer walk. There was a footpath not far from the stream that seemed to wind up into the hills behind the cabin. I followed it for an hour or so. At one point, I passed an old stone wall mostly swallowed by moss and undergrowth, and further along, the remains of what looked like a sheep pen. No one around, just miles of woods and open ground. I didn't bring a map, but I made sure to keep track of the path behind me. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was sweating and a little sore, but it felt good. I hadn't done that much walking in ages. I warmed up more stew, then sat and watched the trees from the window. That night was quiet again, except for a storm that blew in just before dawn. I lay awake for an hour listening to the rain on the roof and the wind pulling at the eaves. The cabin felt solid, though, safe. On the third day, I noticed something that didn't quite fit. It was late morning, and I had just come back from collecting water down at the stream. I was pouring it into the plastic container inside when I looked out the front window and saw a person. Someone standing near the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned out near the path. It was a woman. At first I thought it was just someone hiking, but then I realized she wasn't moving. She was facing the cabin, but not directly. Her head was slightly down, like she was looking at the ground in front of her. She stood completely still, arms at her sides. Long brown coat, dark trousers underneath, hair tucked into a hood or scarf. I watched her for at least 30 seconds, waiting for her to wave or approach, or turn and walk away. But she didn't. She just stood there, motionless. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, half expecting her to call out, but nothing happened. The air was cool and there was no wind. She didn't react at all. I waited a bit longer, then stepped off the porch and walked a few feet toward her. As soon as I moved, she turned and walked back into the trees, slow and steady, not hurried. I stayed there for a minute, heart knocking in my chest harder than I expected. Something about her, about how she moved, how she didn't acknowledge me, just felt off. I wasn't scared exactly, but I didn't like it. I didn't see her again that day, and by evening I started to wonder if maybe I had imagined her. But something about it stuck in my head. It wasn't like a hallucination. She was there. I knew it. That night, I kept the lantern burning longer than usual. I sat at the table by the window, half reading, half looking out into the darkness. Once or twice I thought I saw movement. Branches swaying, maybe an animal, but nothing definite. Still, I didn't sleep well. The fourth day, I woke early. The air felt colder, and there was a layer of mist hanging over the ground. I made tea, walked around the cabin, checked for any footprints, but the ground was still too damp and covered in pine needles. Nothing stood out. I tried to relax, to get back to the reason I was there, but the tension had taken hold. I kept glancing out the windows, listening for footsteps that didn't come. It was late afternoon when I saw her again. I had just come back from the stream and was inside, wiping down the counter with a cloth. When I looked up, she was standing at almost the same spot as before, just past the edge of the trees. Same posture, same coat, still as stone. This time I didn't go outside. I stayed at the window and watched. After a long minute, she moved. She didn't turn and walk away like before. This time she walked slowly along the tree line, parallel to the cabin, until she was out of sight. Her head was still angled down, and she never looked up once. Something about her movements bothered me. Too smooth, like she was walking a path she'd walked 1,000 times. I didn't like it. I didn't know who she was, or why she was there, or why she kept showing up and doing nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the bed fully clothed, a flashlight and the hatchet from the woodpile beside me. I wasn't scared in the ghost story sense. I just felt unsettled, alert in a way I hadn't been in years. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, cut the trip short. I'd had enough peace and quiet. But the next morning, the car wouldn't start. I don't know what happened. It had been fine when I parked it, and I hadn't used it since. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The lights were dead. The engine didn't even try. I checked the battery connections, which looked fine. I'm not great with cars, but it didn't feel like something I could fix out there with no tools or signal. I considered walking out, following the gravel road back to the main road, but it would have been a long hike and I didn't know how far the nearest house or town was. So I stayed one more night, planning to walk out early the next morning. That evening, she came closer. I saw her just after sunset. She was standing at the edge of the clearing again, but closer than before, maybe 40 feet from the front of the cabin. I froze when I noticed her. This time, her head was tilted slightly to one side, and I could see her face more clearly. Pale skin, sunken cheeks, lips that barely moved. Her eyes looked almost closed. She didn't blink, just stared. I didn't go outside. I locked the door and pulled the curtains, then sat at the table, staring at the door. My heart was pounding again, but now it wasn't just nerves. I was genuinely afraid. This wasn't a hiker. She wasn't lost. She had no backpack, no dog, no sign of purpose. Just that expression and the way she moved, like she was drifting, half asleep. Around midnight, I heard something move outside. Light footsteps on the porch. The wood creaked once. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair until sunrise. When daylight came, I gathered my things and left. I walked the road, following the gravel track until I reached the main road hours later. A farmer picked me up in his truck and drove me into Dalmally. I didn't tell him about the woman. I arranged for a recovery service to get the car, and I never went back to the cabin. I sent an email to the rental site, telling them the battery had died and I'd left early. That was it. 2 weeks later, I got a message from someone at the site. They said a couple had booked the same cabin after me and had found a coat hanging on the porch. A long brown coat, damp and mildewed, with no ID in the pockets. They asked if it was mine. I told them no. I don't know who she was or what she was doing there. Maybe she lived in the woods nearby. Maybe she had mental health problems. Maybe she thought the cabin was hers. I'll never know, but I still think about her sometimes. The way she stood, the way she watched without really watching. The way she moved like she belonged there and I didn't. I haven't gone back to the Highlands since. It was a chilly evening when I arrived at the small cabin on the outskirts of Custer, South Dakota. I'd rented it for the weekend, hoping for a bit of peace and solitude, the type of quiet that only a remote cabin in the woods could offer. The road to get here was long and winding, but I wasn't in any hurry. My goal was simple: relax. I'd been working non-stop in my job as a freelance photographer, and I needed a break. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. Wooden, with faded paint and a sagging porch that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of stain in years. A slight breeze rustled the tall grass around the place, and the smell of pine and earth filled the air. It wasn't perfect, but it was exactly what I needed. Just me, the trees, and the silence. After unloading my bags, I decided to take a look around. The cabin sat on a small plot of land surrounded by thick trees, the kind of dense forest you could easily get lost in if you weren't careful. The only sounds were the distant call of birds and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I set up my camera gear by the porch, testing the light and the landscape. There was something about the stillness here that felt a little eerie, but it wasn't enough to make me uneasy. After all, it was just a cabin in the woods, right? The first night passed without incident. I cooked a simple dinner in the kitchen, enjoyed a few beers, and settled in front of the fireplace. The crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind were the only noises that kept me company. By the time I turned in for the night, I felt a strange sense of comfort in the isolation. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake a feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't an overt sensation, more like a subtle awareness of something just out of sight. I pushed it aside, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings and the shadows that danced on the walls. The feeling persisted as I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't strong enough to keep me awake. The next day, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin. The sun was already up, casting a soft light through the thin curtains. I took a deep breath, stretching my arms above my head, and smiled to myself. Another day to enjoy the peace. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the kitchen and stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The forest looked even more beautiful in the daylight, the trees swaying gently in the wind. As I stood there, I noticed something odd. There was a small trail leading into the woods, barely visible unless you were paying attention. I hadn't seen it the night before. Curiosity tugged at me, so I decided to follow it. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but it seemed to head deeper into the forest, away from the cabin. I walked for what felt like an hour, the trees growing thicker as I ventured further. The trail grew steeper, and I had to watch my step, avoiding branches and uneven ground. The silence of the forest was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. I couldn't help but feel like something was off, like I wasn't supposed to be here. The further I went, the more that feeling grew. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on me. Eventually, the trail opened up to a small clearing. In the center, there was an old, dilapidated shed. It was made of weathered wood, its door hanging loosely on one hinge. The shed looked ancient, abandoned for years. I felt a strange pull toward it, but something held me back. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the shed, debating whether to investigate further. My gut told me to turn around, but my curiosity was stronger. Slowly, I approached the shed, the wood creaking under my feet as I drew closer. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit me immediately. It was dark, save for a few beams of light that filtered through cracks in the walls. The interior was empty, save for a few old tools scattered on the floor and a large wooden crate in the corner. I walked over to the crate, my heart pounding a little faster now. What was this place? Why did it feel so wrong? I crouched down and, with some effort, pried open the lid of the crate. Inside, There was nothing but dirt. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something else. Something that didn't belong. A series of markings had been scratched into the wooden bottom of the crate. They were crude, uneven, and looked like they had been made with something sharp. At first, I couldn't make out the patterns, but then I realized what they were. Symbols. Strange, foreign symbols carved deeply into the wood. I leaned closer, trying to understand their meaning, when a sudden noise from outside caused me to jump. I stood up quickly, my heart racing as I rushed to the door. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. He was tall, dressed in old, worn clothing, and he had a weathered, unshaven face. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but the moment I saw him, I knew something wasn't right. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me like he was waiting for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen, as if they couldn't move. Without breaking his gaze, the man turned slowly and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to do. Should I follow him? Should I go back to the cabin? The decision seemed impossible, but my feet moved before I could think, taking me back along the trail toward the cabin. The rest of the day passed without incident. I didn't see the man again, nor did I venture back to the shed. But the unsettling feeling lingered. It wasn't just the man, it was the whole place. The cabin, the woods, the symbols in the shed. It all felt wrong. The night was quiet, too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it. I went to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would ease my mind. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept drifting back to that man, to the shed, to the strange feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was. Around midnight, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there. I didn't move. I didn't dare make a sound, listening intently for any further noises. There was a soft tap on the window, then a pause, and then the sound of footsteps moving away from the cabin. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, too scared to check outside. But when I finally mustered the courage to get up and look through the window, there was nothing. The porch was empty. No sign of the man, no sign of anyone at all. The next morning, I decided to leave. There was no way I was staying another night in that cabin. I packed my things quickly, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. Who was the man? What had I seen in that shed? And why had it all felt so wrong? As I drove away, leaving the cabin behind, I couldn't help but look back at the thick forest that surrounded it. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop to investigate. I just kept driving, grateful to be leaving that place behind. It was weeks before I could shake the unease that had settled into my bones. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. That cabin, the shed, and whatever happened out there were best left forgotten. It was early October 2021 when I decided to take a short break from work. I was 33, living in Springfield, Missouri, and had been working from home full-time for over a year. The stress of non-stop Zoom meetings and deadlines was starting to get to me. I hadn't taken a proper break since the start of the pandemic, and I needed time away from screens, noise, and people. I booked a small, off-grid cabin in northern Arkansas, tucked deep in the Ozark Mountains, about 3 hours south of where I lived. It was listed as a hunter's cabin, remote and basic, no internet, no cell service, no electricity, Just a wood stove, an outhouse, and a hand pump for water. That's exactly what I wanted. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going. Just said I'd be off the grid for a few days and left it at that. I packed enough food for 5 days, mostly canned stuff, pasta, rice, a few basic vegetables, and snacks. I brought a portable gas stove, a good flashlight, extra batteries, and a battery-powered lantern. I brought a thick sleeping bag, a hatchet, my old .38 revolver I kept for emergencies, and a box of shells. The drive out was peaceful. The leaves had just started turning, and the winding roads through the hills were beautiful. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon on a Wednesday. It was even more remote than I expected. After leaving the main road, I had to take a gravel track for nearly 30 minutes, winding through dense woods with no signs of other people. No houses, not even a mailbox. The cabin itself was small, just one room with a tiny table, a cot, and a wood stove in the corner. It looked old but sturdy. There was a small shed out back that stored firewood, a rusty wheelbarrow, and some tools. The outhouse was a short walk downhill, near the edge of a small creek. The air smelled clean. No hum of traffic, no distant dogs barking, no people. Just birds and wind and the creak of trees. That first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the stove to warm the place, heated a can of chili on the gas stove, and read a book by lantern light. It got cold after dark, but I was layered up and had a good sleeping bag. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I hiked around a bit, nothing too far. I found a game trail heading northwest behind the cabin and followed it for about a mile before it started climbing steeply. I didn't go farther, wasn't trying to get lost. I marked a tree where I turned back with a small notch from my hatchet just in case. Later, I sat out behind the cabin for a few hours, just listening. Squirrels chased each other through the leaves. Birds called out in the branches. I saw a couple of deer cross through the trees maybe 200 feet away. That night, I made pasta with canned tomatoes and green beans and fell asleep early. It was the third night when things started to feel off. It was around midnight when I woke up, needing to pee. I bundled up, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. It was colder than the night before, and the sky was clouded over, no moon. The flashlight beam was narrow and didn't reach far. I walked to the outhouse, did my business, and started heading back. That's when I heard something in the trees. Not a loud noise, just a branch breaking. Then silence. Then another small crunch. I froze. I scanned the trees with the flashlight but couldn't see anything. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, something didn't feel right. The noises had stopped, but I kept sweeping the trees with the light, hand on the revolver in my jacket pocket. I didn't want to panic over nothing, but I waited a few extra seconds before heading back inside. Inside the cabin, I bolted the door, added a few pieces of wood to the stove, and laid back down. Took a while to fall asleep. The next morning was cloudy and colder. I made instant coffee and ate a granola bar, then decided to take another walk. This time, I stayed closer. I walked the perimeter of the small clearing where the cabin sat, just getting a feel for the space. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. I could tell because they were from boots, larger than my own, and went around the back of the cabin toward the woods. I followed them a few feet before they veered off sharply into the trees and disappeared into fallen leaves. I checked my own boots against them. Different tread pattern. Not mine. It rattled me. I hadn't seen another vehicle on the gravel road coming in. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the highway 2 days ago. And yet, someone had been walking near the cabin. I decided to stay put the rest of the day. I kept the revolver on my hip and stayed mostly inside, just peeking out now and then. Nothing else happened that day or night, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up at every sound outside. Wind, sticks cracking. Once I thought I heard breathing near the window, but it might have just been the stove hissing. On the 5th morning, I planned to leave early. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed up, made sure I had everything, and loaded up the car. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something nailed to a tree about 50 feet behind the cabin. I hadn't seen it before. It was a small strip of metal, looked like a bent license plate, tacked to the tree with a rusty nail. I walked over to look at it. There were scratch marks on it, deep gouges, not letters or numbers, like someone had taken a knife or some sharp tool and carved erratically across the surface over and over again. At the base of the tree was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, I think. Maybe a rabbit or squirrel. I backed away, heart beating fast. I got in the car and drove. The gravel road felt longer than I remembered. Every turn I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting someone to appear behind me. But no one did. Back on the main road, I finally got a bar of signal. I pulled over and called my brother just to hear a familiar voice. Even though I didn't tell him much, I just said I was heading home early, not feeling well. When I got home, I checked the cabin listing again. It was still there, still available for rent. I left a short review, just said it was very remote, beautiful, but I cut my trip short. I didn't say anything else. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I just wanted to put it behind me. A week later, I kept thinking about those footprints, that scratched metal plate, the bones. I hadn't imagined any of it. I knew that, so I went back online, found the parcel listing through county records. The land was owned by someone in their 70s who lived in Kansas City. They'd inherited it, apparently, hadn't been to the property in years. The listing had been posted by some third-party rental company. I emailed the company and asked if they had other reports of trespassers or anyone else using the land. They never replied. I've camped many times before, hiked alone, stayed in remote places, but that was the first time I ever felt truly watched. Not just the feeling of being in nature, but being watched by someone who didn't want to be seen. I don't know what they were doing, or how long they'd been out there. I didn't go camping again for over a year, and when I did, I brought a friend. I haven't stayed in a remote cabin alone since. I've thought about it, but something in me says no, not again. Some people are out there for the same reason I was. Peace, quiet, a break from the noise. But others are out there for different reasons. Reasons they don't want you to know. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you end up in the same woods. It was early November when I decided to take a break from the city. I'd been working non-stop for months, and the pressure of deadlines and constant emails had worn me thin. I needed quiet, solitude, somewhere far away from everything. A place where I could clear my head, even if it was just for a weekend. So, I rented a small cabin in the woods of northern New Hampshire, deep in the mountains where the nearest town was miles away. I thought it was going to be perfect, peaceful, isolated, and exactly what I needed. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest gas station. The road leading up to it wasn't even paved for the last half mile. Just a winding dirt path with ruts and rocks scattered across it. It felt like I was heading into the middle of nowhere, and honestly, I liked that. I'd been driving for hours, the landscape turning from suburban sprawl to dense forests, and the air had started to feel fresher as I climbed higher into the mountains. The last sign of civilization was a little diner I passed about 30 minutes ago. Since then, the silence had been deafening, broken only by the sound of my tires crunching the gravel. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, and the first few stars had begun to poke through. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of thick logs with a steep slanted roof and a chimney on one side. The windows were simple, framed in old wood. There was a small porch out front with a couple of chairs, but no one had bothered to sit there in a while. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, and the forest around it was thick with trees, their leaves already turned and scattered across the ground. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was musty, but not unpleasant. The place had that old cabin feel to it. Wooden floors creaking underfoot, old furniture, a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a window that overlooked the surrounding forest. The cabin wasn't much, just a living room, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and one bedroom with a bed that looked like it had seen better days. But it was perfect for what I needed, a place to be alone. I spent the first evening settling in, unpacking my things, and making a quick dinner. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, and I found myself in front of the fire with a book. The crackling of the logs and the soft glow of the flames made the place feel cozy, even if the silence outside was overwhelming. I hadn't seen a single car on the drive-in, and now that I was here, I felt like I was truly isolated. Around midnight, I started to feel a strange unease, though I couldn't put my finger on why. It wasn't that anything specific had happened, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I could see or hear. It was just a gut feeling, a sense of being watched, of something being off. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing but the blackness of the forest stretching out in all directions. I spent the next few hours trying to sleep, but the unease never left. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside, and every so often, a branch would scrape against the side of the cabin, making the whole place groan. It was the kind of noise that would make you think something was trying to get in. But it was just the wind, I told myself. That's all. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. I couldn't remember the dream, but something about it had disturbed me deeply. I sat up, wiping the sweat off my forehead, and tried to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The fire had gone out, and the room was cold now. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but the unease was still there. I glanced around the cabin, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the furniture, the empty room, and the darkened windows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got up and moved over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was silent, almost too quiet. I stood there for a while, staring out into the blackness, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned away from the window, I noticed something strange, a shadow moving at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, making the branches sway. But the shadow didn't move like a tree branch. It was deliberate, seemed to pause, as if watching the cabin. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart was racing, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt truly scared. I stood there in the dark, watching the shadow shift and move, then vanish into the trees. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal or perhaps a trick of the light. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that it wasn't either of those things. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and went to the front door, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. The cabin felt small now, like a cage, and the shadows outside seemed to press in closer. I stood by the door for a few minutes, listening, but there was only silence. No sound of footsteps or branches snapping. Nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything up. With my flashlight in hand, I stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I immediately regretted not grabbing my jacket. I swept the beam of light across the yard, but all I saw were trees, the same trees that had been there when I arrived. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the shadow had been nothing more than a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something, a soft crunching sound coming from the woods. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, straining to listen, The sound grew louder, closer. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush, coming toward the cabin. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat begin to form on the back of my neck. I tried to make myself move back inside, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I considered running back to the car, but the idea of leaving the cabin and venturing into the woods alone terrified me. Whatever was out there, I wasn't ready to face it. I crept back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin was silent again, but the feeling of dread had grown tenfold. I grabbed the chair by the fireplace and placed it against the door, trying to reassure myself that I was safe. I couldn't explain what had just happened or what was still happening outside, but I knew I wasn't alone. Hours passed. The night stretched on endlessly, and the feeling of being watched never left. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the noise outside stopped. The forest went quiet again, and I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been in my head. When the sun rose completely, I decided to leave. The eerie feeling hadn't disappeared, and I wasn't willing to stick around and find out who or what had been lurking outside my cabin. I packed up my things quickly, loaded them into my car, and left without a second thought. As I drove back down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every turn I made, I thought I saw something in the rearview mirror. But when I looked, there was nothing there, just the empty road behind me. I didn't go back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. It wasn't just the strange shadow I saw that night or the noise outside. It was the way the forest seemed to close in around me, the way the silence was so thick it felt suffocating. That cabin had been more than just a place of rest. It had been a place where someone was waiting, and I have a feeling I'll never truly know what it was. But for now, I'm far away, and I've made my peace with it. The woods are beautiful from a distance, and I'll leave it at that. Some things are better left undisturbed. I never expected it to be like this. I always thought a weekend away in the woods, at a secluded cabin, would be the perfect escape from the usual noise of the city. The kind of peace you can't get from the constant buzz of phone notifications or the thrum of traffic. I wanted quiet, fresh air, and a break from work. Just me, some time to clear my head, and the sound of nature surrounding me. What I didn't expect was to find myself so unnerved by something that I couldn't explain. The cabin was nestled in a remote part of the Oregon woods, far from the nearest town, or even any real signs of civilization. I'd found it online through a rental site, nothing too fancy, just a small, one-story log cabin with a few basic amenities. The reviews spoke of it as a great hideaway for anyone wanting to be left alone. I figured it'd be the perfect spot for a weekend by myself. I hadn't taken time off in years, and I'd been running on fumes lately, both from work and life in general. It was early October when I decided to make the trip. The trees had just begun to turn those shades of red and gold that you only get in fall. The drive out had been long, about 4 hours from Portland, but I didn't mind. I had my music playing, the windows cracked to let in the cool air, and I felt like I was finally escaping into something peaceful. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The place sat on a small hill surrounded by thick woods, and the dirt driveway that led up to it was barely wide enough for my truck. I parked, unloaded my bags, and took a deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented air. For a moment, I felt like I'd made the right choice. Everything felt perfect. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, a simple structure with wooden beams and a rustic stone fireplace. The porch creaked underfoot, and the door had a brass handle that felt cool to the touch as I opened it. Inside, the place had that cozy, lived-in charm. A mix of old and new furniture, a well-used kitchen with mismatched plates, and a large window that gave a view of the forest. Everything about it screamed home, even though I wasn't supposed to be there for long. The first night went smoothly. I unpacked my things, made a simple dinner, just a canned stew I'd brought along, and sat on the porch, eating in silence. The quiet was almost unnerving at first, but I quickly settled into it. I had a book with me, but the night sky was too inviting, so I decided to leave the book inside and just stare up at the stars. As I sat there, the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. It was peaceful, but there was something about the isolation that felt off. Something about how empty it was. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched, but I dismissed it. After all, who would be out here? I was in the middle of nowhere. The first night passed without incident, and I slept soundly in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. I woke up the next morning to a crisp, cold breeze coming through the cracks in the windows, and I felt refreshed. The perfect day for a hike, I thought. I spent most of that second day exploring the area around the cabin. I walked through the woods, taking in the colors of autumn and the scent of damp earth. I found a small creek not far from the cabin, where the water trickled over rocks and the moss covered the surrounding trees like thick green blankets. I spent a few hours just sitting by the water, listening to the gentle rush of it, trying to push the lingering feeling of unease from my mind. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was no real reason to feel like something was wrong, but the longer I stayed there, the more I felt it. It wasn't the place itself. Hell, it was beautiful, peaceful, but something about the woods around me made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. I kept hearing noises, snaps of branches, rustling leaves, but I never saw anyone or anything. I brushed it off, thinking it was just wildlife. The isolation must have been messing with my head. That night, I decided to stay inside. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and read a little. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside swayed violently in the gusts. The fire crackled, and I felt cozy, but that feeling didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, soft at first, like a whisper. I strained my ears, holding my breath, but it was just the wind, right? I tried to convince myself, but then it came again, louder, the unmistakable sound of something. No, someone, scratching at the door. I froze, staring at the door to the cabin. My heart began to pound. No one was supposed to be out here. I was isolated, in the middle of nowhere. But someone was outside, I was sure of it. I waited, trying to listen for any other sound, but it was dead quiet. The wind had stopped howling, and all I could hear was my own breath, coming out in quick, shallow gasps. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and slowly crept to the door, shining the light through the small crack in the wooden frame. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack, shining the light into the darkness. The beam of light bounced off the trees and then the empty yard, revealing nothing. My heart slowed a little, but the sense of unease didn't go away. I closed the door and bolted it shut, then went back to the couch, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The rest of the night passed in restless sleep, but I didn't hear anything else. When morning came, I was exhausted. My nerves were on edge, and I was tempted to pack up and leave right then. But I had paid for the whole weekend, and I wasn't about to let a little unease ruin it. I decided to stick it out, but I kept the door locked and the windows shut. The next few days passed in a blur. The eerie feeling never quite left me, and I spent most of my time staying inside, watching the woods from the cabin's windows. I didn't venture far anymore. Every time I thought about heading back into the trees, something held me back. I kept hearing strange noises from outside, scratching, thumping, and sometimes even the faint sound of footsteps, but I never saw anyone. Not once. By the time the third evening rolled around, I had made my mind up. I wasn't going to stay here another night. I had had enough. The entire time I had been there, I had not felt truly alone, and the feeling that I was being watched, followed, had only grown stronger. I packed my things quickly, gathered my gear, and as night began to fall, I threw the last of my bags into the truck. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it, something scraping against the side of the cabin. I turned, heart racing, but I saw nothing. No figures in the shadows, no movement in the trees. I don't know what made me do it, but I decided to check around the cabin one last time before I left. As I circled the cabin, flashlight in hand, I noticed something strange. The ground around the back of the cabin was disturbed, like someone had recently been digging. I knelt down, shining the flashlight on the dirt. It wasn't much, just a small patch of earth that had been scraped away, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been near the cabin. That was enough for me. I got back in my truck and left, driving fast, not looking back once. The woods seemed to swallow the cabin whole as I pulled away, and I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town. Looking back, I can't explain it. It's been years now, but I still wonder what was going on around that cabin. Who was there? Why did they stay hidden? The woods are still beautiful, but I'll never forget the way it felt, to be watched, to be alone in a place that should have been safe. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, I know one thing for sure. There was someone else out there, someone who didn't want me there. I had no idea what I was getting into when I decided to spend the weekend at that cabin. My friend Luke had rented the place up in the mountains, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. At first, it seemed like a peaceful getaway, just what I needed. Luke had promised me some downtime away from the hustle of city life, just a couple of days to clear my head, fish in the nearby lake, and maybe do a little hiking. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined when I thought about a secluded retreat. A small, rustic wooden structure with a chimney, a porch that faced the lake, and surrounded by dense trees. The weather was perfect when we arrived. It was late autumn, and the air was crisp, with the trees showing off the last of their golden leaves. There was something oddly peaceful about it. I could already feel the stress of city life melting away. The first night was calm. We had a fire going, sipped on some beers, and watched the flames dance. Luke was in a great mood, excited about the next couple of days. I wasn't expecting much excitement, just the kind of weekend that was good for recharging. I thought we'd get up early, fish, hike, and maybe enjoy some peace and quiet. But things started to take a strange turn the following evening. The first odd thing happened when I noticed a strange vehicle parked near the road leading to the cabin. At first, I thought it was just someone else staying up in the area, but it wasn't exactly a place with a lot of traffic, so it felt off. Luke didn't seem bothered by it and shrugged it off when I mentioned it. Probably just someone else enjoying the weekend, he said. The next morning, we went out to the lake, just the two of us, hoping to catch some fish. We didn't talk much while we fished, enjoying the quiet solitude of the water. But I kept glancing back at the road, which was barely visible through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Around midday, while we were taking a break, we noticed something strange. A small group of people had walked into the clearing by the lake. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out any details at first, but I could tell they weren't hiking or doing anything normal. They moved in a way that seemed unnatural, almost like they were sneaking around, and it was unsettling. We watched them for a while, unsure what to do. The group was moving closer to the cabin, but it was odd. They didn't look like tourists or hikers. They were dressed in a mix of clothing, some of it clearly out of place for a wilderness area like this. They didn't seem to have any camping gear with them, which made no sense for a group that would be out here. Luke looked at me, his expression serious for the first time. We should head back. I agreed, and we quickly packed up our things, trying not to make it obvious that we were rushing. We made our way back to the cabin, but as we got closer, we noticed that the group was now at the cabin itself. There was no denying it. They were looking at our place, peering in through the windows. It was unsettling how they didn't seem to care that they were so close to us. We huddled in the cabin, locking the doors and windows. We didn't know what to make of it. Maybe they're just curious, Luke said, trying to sound calm, but his voice betrayed his own unease. I wasn't so sure. There was something off about them. They seemed out of place in a way that I couldn't quite explain. The next few hours were a blur. We stayed inside, trying to keep our presence hidden, but I kept hearing noises around the cabin. Footsteps, the sound of something scraping against the wood. I tried to ignore it, but the air in the cabin felt heavy, like it was thick with tension. It was as if we were being watched from every corner. By nightfall, things had gotten worse. The group of people had set up camp near the cabin. I could see them through a crack in the curtains, sitting around a small fire, laughing quietly. The way they spoke to each other, the low, murmured voices, only added to my growing fear. They didn't seem normal. There was something wrong with them, like they didn't belong here. I wanted to call the authorities, but there was no cell service, and Luke didn't think it was worth making a big deal of it. They're probably just some locals out for a hike, he said, but I knew deep down that this wasn't normal behavior. I had a gut feeling that something was wrong, something that was about to escalate. We decided to stay inside for the night. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and we sat in silence. The night felt endless. I kept hearing those footsteps outside, closer now, as if they were circling the cabin. I was on edge, my muscles tense, ready to jump at any noise. Around 2 a.m., we both heard it loud, deliberate knocks on the front door. We froze. The knocks were slow, almost calculated. They didn't sound like a person just trying to get in. They sounded like a warning. A few seconds passed, and then another set of knocks came, louder this time. Luke motioned for me to stay quiet, his eyes wide. We both stared at the door, hardly breathing. A few moments passed, but it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. We sat in silence for what seemed like an eternity, until I finally spoke. "What do we do?" Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, his eyes darting to the windows. "I think we should leave," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Now." I didn't hesitate. We grabbed our bags, throwing what we could into the car as quickly as we could. But the fear of leaving, knowing that those people were still out there, kept me from thinking clearly. I kept thinking about the knocks on the door, the way they circled the cabin. There was no reason for it. We were alone up here. No one should have been anywhere near the cabin. By the time we got in the car and started driving away, the sun had barely begun to rise. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, nearly 2 hours away. We found a small diner and took a seat, trying to shake off the tension in our bodies. It was a relief to be around other people again, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. What were they doing at the cabin? Who were those people? But the strangest part was what happened when we were sitting in the diner. A woman at a table across from us overheard our conversation. She leaned over and said, "You guys staying up at that cabin? You're lucky you made it out of there." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight. She looked at us seriously. "That place is bad news. It's been empty for years, and no one goes up there anymore. People say it's cursed, but the truth is, there's a group that uses it to hide out. They don't bother anyone unless you get too close. I wouldn't go back up there if I were you." Luke and I exchanged looks. We didn't know what to say. The woman's words had confirmed everything we'd felt that night. We didn't go back. Neither of us ever mentioned the trip again. Something about it stuck with me, how everything felt wrong, how the people outside the cabin seemed so out of place. It wasn't just a random encounter. Whatever had happened that weekend, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something far worse. To this day, I still don't know exactly who those people were or what they wanted. But I learned my lesson. There's no such thing as a simple weekend getaway in a remote cabin. Sometimes, staying in the city might just be the safer option.